Hello again, and welcome back to the Lydia McGrew channel. I'm going to continue today talking about arguments from silence. You'll recall that last time I talked about arguments from silence in history and especially in biblical studies, and I talked about how the presence of a piece of evidence can be good evidence for a conclusion, while the absence of that same piece of evidence can be very poor evidence against that conclusion. And I used the analogy of my seeing a spider and how that is good evidence that there's a spider in this room, my seeming to see a spider up close. But the mere absence of that apparent sight of a spider is poor evidence against the proposition that there's a spider somewhere in this room. And I even gave a little bit of the math for that. It's a little counterintuitive. And I emphasized that for an author, simply to not mention something is not the same as his saying that it did not happen, and it shouldn't be taken that way. This was with reference to some comments made back in the winter by philosopher Dustin Crummett apropos of a video by Eric Manning about skeptical objections to the virgin birth on the grounds that the virgin birth is not mentioned in the book of Mark. So go and watch that earlier video. I won't keep recapping it. Here I want to move on to the analogy to sensory experience. One of Crummett's arguments was that this comment that Testify channel made based on my husband's paper on arguments from silence was a merely negative conclusion, and an overly strong negative conclusion drawn on the basis of a few instances, as if, said Crummett, we were to say, well, sometimes my senses have been wrong, therefore sensory experience is just unreliable, I'm not going to use it at all. So it's a really poor analogy to arguments from silence, especially arguments from silence against testimonial evidence. So the silence of one document, Mark, for example, is allowed to stand as pretty strong evidence, casting into doubt the positive statement found in Matthew or Luke or John. Making an argument against our sensory evidence across the board to where we were suggesting that we just shouldn't use it would be making an argument against a ubiquitous tool of investigation of non-deductive propositions. Now, I'm a foundationalist, so I'm not going to say that my senses are reliable. It's properly basic, as Alvin Plantinga uses that term. However, it certainly is a pretty widely used tool in our investigation of a bunch of other non-deductive conclusions, like, what happened today, what I had for lunch, and high-level scientific theories, and everything in between. So, even though it's a defeasible proposition that my senses are reliable, it would be really difficult to get along in gaining other non-deductive knowledge if I just abandoned it. Now, I could still conclude that my senses were unreliable if I had, sufficient chaotic evidence, maybe that my senses had become unreliable when they were previously reliable. So if my sense of hearing is getting worse as I get older or something like that. But that's not a good analogy to abandoning the argument from silence in history as used against testimony. So what we're talking about here would, if we tried to turn this into a similar sort of general rule of thumb, it would be something like this. It is a reliable and epistemically legitimate method of inference to distrust positive evidence in favor of some occurrence due to an extremely confident prediction we already made that some other source would have reported this occurrence if it were true. Okay? So that would be what we'd be talking about. And that's hardly a widely needed tool of inference. I don't believe that we have some large suite of cases where that's obviously legitimate. Yeah, I definitely have this high prediction, not just a ratio, but a high probability. If this happened, this particular person, this particular source would tell it. And then I get some other source that also has a claim to being believed that does positively tell it. And, those two just cross cancel. I put a big question mark over the second source, or I abandon it altogether. I say, nah, that must just be wrong because I was so confident that this other specific source would report it. That's a kind of complex form of reasoning in and of itself. And I'm not saying you could never do that. It's going to depend on the relative probabilities of all the different propositions involved. But it's definitely not down at this sort of very early level in all of our scientific, historical, daily, non-deductive inference, like, I have some kind of decent sensory contact with the external world. And notice, too, that in the case of the virgin birth, the principle isn't even just that everything has to be reported twice in history and survive for us to find it reported twice. That's not even enough because we've got both Matthew and Luke mentioning the virgin birth, but it's even more specific. If it's not in Mark, I'm going to doubt it. Like, everything has to be in Mark. That's what this kind of principle becomes. And you'd be surprised at how much you do find that kind of, almost elevation of Mark as if he's the gospel and nothing should be trusted or believed if it's not found in Mark. Not only in miraculous matters, but even in things like the I am sayings, for example, in John. Well, it's not in Mark, So I think that's a far more questionable principle than that I have relatively reliable sensory access to the world. So I'd like to make some better analogies. Notice that in the analogy to sensory data, the idea is that it's just a negative conclusion. Well, my senses are unreliable. That's terrible, but I'm stuck. Okay, it's just a completely negative conclusion. When we say something like, we human beings are pretty bad at making guesses about what some author in history would report in some particular document, that's a fairly shorthanded way to put it. And part of the purpose of this mini-series that I'm doing here is to flesh that out more into a positive item of knowledge. So it's not just we're really bad at X. That's a good short way of putting it. But a more detailed or longer way of putting it would be to say that what people are interested in reporting in a particular context, what they have knowledge of, and what they report within a particular time period, within a particular document, is subject to a great deal of variation and idiosyncrasy. And so anybody who is out there making these highly confident statements, I try not to do that. I try not to be part of the we anymore who guesses, oh yeah, that would definitely be in this document by Marco Polo or Ulysses S. Grant or whatever. If it happened, it would definitely be there. I don't do that anymore. So, I'm not we anymore. But those who do make such confident comments, the reason that they are often wrong and that they are overconfident is due to this quality of the randomness of saliency. And also, which I'll be examining more in the next video, the randomness of preservation of documents over many, many years of time. And that's very important too. I talked about the randomness of saliency in connection with symbolic interpretations of the Gospels. So this property is relevant in more than one context. When we find John, for example, mentioning that it was a coal fire, a charcoal fire, in the courtyard of the high priest, it would be unjustified to try to find some deep symbolic meaning for charcoal. Okay, the randomness of saliency. Somebody, I would say the beloved disciple himself, remembered that and reported it just because. It just popped up in his head. All right, randomness of saliency is why we don't put heavy meaning, or shouldn't put heavy meaning on it when someone who's telling us something mentions some sort of random detail. Similarly, the randomness of saliency should prevent us from putting heavy meaning on something when it's not found. I've been recently thinking about a theory that Michael Licona floated in his book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? He didn't come down on it definitely, but he kind of floated it as a plausible possibility that Mark actively suppressed the report that the other thief on the cross repented because he wanted to portray Jesus as forsaken by all. And that's a really big over-reading of the mere fact that the repentance of the thief on the cross is not found in Mark. The randomness of saliency. I think Mark may never have heard about it, but also there's just the fact that he's, could be just focused on something else. He's telling other things in his story of Jesus' crucifixion, and he just doesn't happen to report that. The randomness of saliency should also lead us to recognize that we shouldn't jump to the conclusion that something isn't true. We should have more humility than that, than to say it definitely would be reported here if it happened. I know you're going to say, oh, this is you if you're a biblical scholar or a skeptic. Oh, if Mark knew about the virgin birth, surely he would have reported it. I think we need to be more humble about that. Or if Peter, who was Mark's main source, knew about the virgin birth, surely he would have mentioned it in his preaching, which Mark is using. Notice this randomness of saliency concern is compounded when we've got multiple links in the chain. Peter wasn't present, personally in the life of Jesus' family when Jesus was born, which leads to the possibility that Peter did not hear about the virgin birth, while Matthew and Luke did. Peter is then another link in the chain. He could be focused on other things while he's preaching. And I know we find the virgin birth interesting, and there obviously were ancient Christians who did as well, but maybe Peter just didn't mention it in his sermons in Rome for whatever reason. We don't need to hypothesize some highly specific reason. Or if he mentioned it in some context, maybe Mark, who heard of it, said, I'm just not taking the time to do Jesus' infancy and childhood. I mean, Mark doesn't even, as far as I can recall, mention the name of Jesus' mother or father. So, just focusing on the ministry. So we've got multiple places where that randomness of saliency can influence our possessing a report in a specific document from a specific author. So I would suggest a different analogy. And this is kind of a weird analogy that occurred to me, which is romantic interest. Suppose you said, definitely, if A meets B, he will be very romantically interested in her. He will fall in love with her. And then someone testifies that, he met her, but never showed the slightest sign of romantic interest in her. And you disbelieve that testimony. You say, no, either you just missed it, he was definitely really romantically interested. Not that you have any definite evidence that he was, but just you've decided a priori that he would be, or you must just be wrong. He must never have met her, okay? Or even putting a big question mark over that. I just don't know if he'd ever met her, because I'm sure he would have fallen in love with her if he would have met her. We know that human beings are idiosyncratic and have a lot of variability in romantic interest, and that leads to legitimate humility that we should have about giving that like high absolute probability. You know, it's not just that it's, you know, more probable than not or something, but no, it's really up there that if so-and-so meets so-and-so, there's going to be romantic interest there. We know more about human nature than that. And what we know about the variability of testimony from these calibration examples that my husband Tim gives in his argument from silence case, and that we'll sometimes use about documents where you might think it would mention, you know, the plague or the fire of London or the Great Wall of China or the Emancipation Proclamation. You know, if you were given to these kind of highly confident predictions, you would predict it here, but you would be wrong. We learn that property in human reportage of variability. I think another good analogy here would be discovering in a medical context that a certain symptom is not always manifested in a certain disease. That the person can have the disease as shown by some other test, maybe a DNA test or a different kind of imaging, for example, but it doesn't show up on this kind of imaging, or the person doesn't have tremors. Tremors can be, let's say, a symptom, but maybe it's not a symptom. They can be asymptomatic as far as tremors are concerned and yet still have this particular disease. Or, you know, as we discovered during COVID, which I almost hesitate to mention, that you can have the germ and yet be asymptomatic. The germ can be multiplying within your body, but you're not, you know, sneezing all over the place. So we recognize that by calibrating. Okay, a doctor might think, you know, in the days of X-rays, and no better imaging. I mean, we still use X-rays, but we have multiple kinds of imaging. We have CT scans and MRIs and so forth, and we have different enhanced scans and MRIs where you put some kind of dye in the patient and so forth. But when they only had X-rays, and they did an X-ray, a lung tumor might not show on the X-ray. And you might have thought, okay, this guy doesn't have lung cancer because no tumor showed on the X-ray. But then we've learned that there can be tumors that don't show up, and the tumor's really there, but it doesn't show up on that kind of imaging. That's positive empirical knowledge that we learn. That's not just some kind of, X-rays are unreliable, we shouldn't use them for anything. Or, you know, throw up our hands. We have no medical knowledge of anything. You know, it's not some kind of sweeping and implausible rejection of medical knowledge, but it's learning more about particular diseases and how they are present in the body and how they correlate and don't correlate with particular symptoms. Similarly, when we're talking about documents or reports, we learn about that randomness of saliency and also the randomness of preservation. Like I say, I'm not emphasizing that so much in this video, but that randomness of saliency, which affects potential reporters at different stages, and that causes us to calibrate so that we learn that kind of empirical humility, and we don't say, you know, this must not have happened, like you must not have lung cancer because so-and-so doesn't report it, because we've got this super high probability that if it happens, so-and-so would report it. Okay, since Mark doesn't tell about Jesus' infancy and childhood at all, this is actually something that should help us to calibrate in that case. It was interesting, the skeptic who kicked this whole thing off, he made a video about the virgin birth and then was responding to that. He mentioned that Mark doesn't talk about Jesus' childhood. And I thought that was interesting because he seemed to think that meant there couldn't be anything remarkable about Jesus' childhood. And I don't see how that follows. I think the fact that Mark doesn't talk about Jesus' childhood at all, even the non-miraculous aspects of it, should actually lead us to question whether even a miraculous aspect of it would be reported in Mark if Mark heard a story about that, since Mark's focus is on the ministry. So that's just one possibility there. Another analogy I would like to make, but this is more than an analogy actually. This is an actual calibration case. A couple of weeks ago, there was a tornado here in Kalamazoo, Michigan, where I live. Okay, properly speaking, the touchdowns were in Portage, which is still within Kalamazoo County. I don't think there was an actual touchdown crossing over into Kalamazoo City proper, but it's accurate to say there was a tornado in Kalamazoo. There were a couple of hours there where we were getting tornado warnings that were unusually frantic. I mean, we get tornado warnings here with some commonness, but these were unusual. These were saying things in capital letters like "Your life is in danger." Get down into your basement if you have a basement. Take shelter, etc. And here's the trajectory. And at one point it was actually heading for our neighborhood where our house is. Now, as it happened, my husband and I were not in town at the time. We weren't far away. I can't travel very far due to my health. So we were about 50 minutes away, closer to Lake Michigan. And there was no warning there. But we heard about the tornado warning here in Kalamazoo really quickly. One of our friends he doesn't even live here, but he really is interested in tornadoes. He found him on his cell phone. And he was like, there is a gigantic tornado headed your way, you know. And two of our adult daughters who were here in Kalamazoo, they got like big emergency warnings on their phone. So, you know, Tim phoned them. We have a basement. Get down into the basement. This one's not kidding. You know, after you live in Kalamazoo for a while, you sometimes go, ho hum, another tornado warning. But this one was serious. And as I say, at one point, the path could actually have taken it right through our own neighborhood. We had a couple of somewhat anxious hours there, watching, reporting on the storm for a while and wondering if it was going to hit our house, if it was going to, you know, tear our roof off or possibly trap our daughters in the basement or anything like that. Fortunately, surprisingly, there was no loss of life actually in the tornado, even though it touched down, destroyed homes and so forth down in Portage in a number of places. You just tore up the tops of trees, completely sheared them off, all kinds of things. So you could say this was a pretty big feature of our vacation, right? Now, suppose that you asked me later, you knew I had been on vacation that week, how was your vacation? You might think that it would have this really high probability that I would say, well, you know, this really interesting thing happened while we were there, blah, 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 and we're over in this other town. There's no danger to us, but we're worrying about our daughters and so forth. Now, maybe I would. Maybe I would mention that. But once the danger had passed for us personally, and in fact, I don't think we even personally know anybody whose house was destroyed. We know somebody whose car was severely damaged, but, you know, it didn't come close to us in that personal way that would make it extremely salient. That prediction would probably be legitimate if our house was destroyed. You know, it's like, well, we had to come back early from our vacation. Our vacation was cut short because our house was destroyed by a tornado and they had to get our daughters out of the basement. Okay, but it didn't even touch down on our property. And, you know, you can call that selfish if you want, but this is part of that randomness of saliency, okay? There is a non-negligible probability that if you asked me that question, I would not mention the tornado back here in Kalamazoo. That instead I would mention other things that were just really great about the vacation, like the stargazing I was able to do because it was much darker there than it is in Kalamazoo where we were, not as much light. And so I was able to see way more stars, you know, or I might mention the goslings that we saw, you know, out behind the house where we were staying, etc. Okay, I think I saw a muskrat. He looked just like the illustrations of Rat in The Wind in the Willows. So I might mention those things. A turkey, a male turkey that looked like he was displaying. I didn't see a female around, so maybe he was just practicing. But anyway, these were really neat things, really cool things about our vacation that I might actually mention to you because they gave me joy and a sense of release and relief, and that's what a vacation is for, rather than the tornado. So that would be another calibration case. That's another case of that randomness of saliency. And you can imagine someone many years in the future, right? Saying, you know, let's suppose that something I wrote about, you know, my vacation was one of the only things to survive, and somebody's saying, well, you know, that there couldn't have been a tornado in Kalamazoo right then because Lydia McGrew lived in Kalamazoo, and here's this document we have about that very week, and she doesn't mention the tornado, right? So, you know, our dating of a tornado must be wrong. It must have happened a different week or whatever. There couldn't have been a tornado in that week, or surely she would mention it. You'd be wrong about that. Big things. So we say, oh, the virgin birth would be a big thing. So, of course, Mark would mention it. I had somebody say to me that if Jesus really visited Jerusalem as often as John reports, surely he would have, Matthew would have mentioned it, because Matthew has a Jewish focus and Jerusalem was important to Jews. You see how this reasoning goes. It becomes really acute when we think about why doesn't Josephus mention the slaughter of the innocents? I've heard skeptics make that actual argument. Well, how many children were involved? Bethlehem was not a very large town. Okay, and Josephus already has a lot of things about what a terrible person Herod the Great was. If anything, those reports about Herod's character should strengthen the case for the slaughter of the innocent in Matthew, because it's a kind of a convergence on the character of Herod the Great, that he thought nothing of saying, go kill all the boy babies in that town. That's the Herod the Great we know and love from Josephus, okay? But instead, the argument is, surely Josephus would have mentioned it. Well, maybe Josephus never even heard about it, because, again, it's a relatively small town, and he's not doing, you know, your daily Bethlehem newspaper. But second, he may have just been, you know, like, I got enough atrocities and terrible things done by Herod, especially to his own family. The Herodian dynasty is of interest to Josephus. These are more prominent people. These aren't just anonymous little babies in some small town. And so he might easily not mention it. The randomness of saliency, it's a property in human testimony. We need to understand that positively and take it into account before we make arguments from silence against testimony. All right, we'll be back next time for a few more thoughts about arguments from silence against testimony in biblical studies. Thanks for watching. I'm Lydia McGrew.